The dusty horizon seemed to shimmer with hope as the hollow-eyed boy of 12, who had not eaten in 3 days, collapsed against the weathered fence post at the edge of the Zachariah ranch. His ragged clothes hung like faded memories on his skeletal frame, and his vacant gaze traveled across the golden Texas plains of 1876, searching for anything that might end his suffering. Mason Zachariah wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his chestnut mare back toward home after a long day of mending fences in the scorching June heat. The 32-year-old cowboy had been working since dawn, and the setting sun cast long shadows across his land, painting everything in amber hues. It was then that he spotted the small figure slumped against his property line. "Whoa there, Penny," Mason murmured to his horse, pulling gently on the reins. He dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle and approached the boy cautiously. The child's eyes fluttered open at the sound of approaching footsteps, fear and resignation battling across his gaunt features. "You all right there, son?" Mason asked, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. The child tried to scoot away, but weakness kept him anchored to the spot. "I ain't stealing nothing, mister," the boy rasped, his voice parched from thirst. "Just resting is all." Mason studied the child, dirty, emaciated, and clearly alone in the world. Something in the boy's defiant yet desperate eyes reminded Mason of himself at that age, before his own life had changed course. "When's the last time you ate, boy?" Mason asked, his voice gentler than the child expected. The boy's eyes darted away. "Don't rightly remember, sir." Mason nodded, coming to a decision that would alter both their lives forever. "Come home with me," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I've got stew on the stove and a spare bed that's gathering dust." The boy stared at the outstretched hand with suspicion born of hard experience. "Why would you help me?" "Because someone once helped me," Mason replied simply. "Name's Mason Zachariah. What do they call you?" "Timothy," the boy whispered. "Timothy Miller, but most folks just call me Tim." "Well, Tim Miller, you look like you could use a friend, and as it happens, so could I." Mason helped the boy onto his horse and mounted behind him. As they rode toward the ranch house that stood as a testament to Mason's years of backbreaking work, neither could have known that this chance encounter would set in motion events that would bring not only salvation for a starving orphan but unexpected love to a lonely cowboy's heart. The Zachariah Ranch was modest by Texas standards, a sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, a barn that needed a fresh coat of paint, and several outbuildings scattered across 20 acres of workable land. What made it remarkable was that Mason had built it all himself, starting with nothing but determination and the skills he'd learned working on other men's ranches. As they approached, Tim's eyes widened at the sight of what seemed to him a palace. Mason helped him down from the horse and steadied him when his legs threatened to buckle. "Let's get some food in you," Mason said, leading the boy inside. The interior of the house was simple but clean, with handcrafted furniture and the lingering scent of wood smoke and coffee. Mason sat Tim at the kitchen table and ladled a generous portion of venison stew into a bowl. "Eat slow," he cautioned. "Your stomach won't be used to much." Tim nodded, though his hands trembled as he lifted the spoon to his mouth. The first taste of warm food nearly brought tears to his eyes, and he had to force himself not to gobble it down like a starved animal. Mason busied himself around the kitchen, giving the boy some privacy with his emotions. He put a kettle on for coffee and cut thick slices of bread, spreading them with butter and placing them near Tim's bowl. "Where are your folks?" Mason asked after Tim had eaten about half the stew. Tim's spoon paused midway to his mouth. "Ma died of fever 2 winters ago. Pa took to drinking after. Got himself killed in a bar fight 6 months back." His matter-of-fact tone spoke of wounds too deep for tears. "You got any other family?" Tim shook his head. "Been making my way west. Heard there was work for everyone in Texas, even boys." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "There's work, all right, not all of it fit for a child, though." "I'm not a child," Tim protested weakly. I'm 12, almost 13. A smile tugged at Mason's lips. I stand corrected. Still, you'll need a proper roof and 3 squares before you can think about earning your keep. Tim's face clouded with suspicion again. What do you want from me, mister? Mason's expression turned serious. Nothing you can't give freely. I could use help around here feeding chickens, collecting eggs, maybe learning to tend the horses once you've got your strength back. In return, you get food, clothes, and that spare bed I mentioned. Fair trade. Tim considered this, his young mind calculating the odds and alternatives. For how long? Let's start with until you're healthy, then we'll talk again. No strings, Tim. You want to leave after that, I won't stop you. The boy nodded slowly. That seems fair. Good. Now finish your stew and I'll show you where you'll be sleeping. That night, as Tim lay in a real bed for the first time in months, clean from a bath and wearing a pair of Mason's old shirts that hung to his knees, he stared at the ceiling and wondered if he was dreaming. In the room down the hall, Mason Zachariah sat at his desk, writing a letter to the town sheriff, inquiring about the legal steps needed to become a guardian to an orphaned boy. Neither knew that this arrangement, begun in simple charity, would soon be complicated by the arrival of a woman who would change everything. Pearl Zimmerman stepped off the stagecoach in the dusty main street of Cottonwood Creek, Texas, with nothing but a carpet bag, the clothes on her back, and a letter offering employment as the town's new schoolteacher. At 27, she had left behind a failed engagement and the suffocating expectations of her family in Boston to forge a new life in the West. The August heat hit her like a physical force as she surveyed the town one Main Street lined with the essential businesses of frontier life. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and the schoolhouse where she would begin teaching in just 1 week. Her stylish Eastern dress with its high collar and tight sleeves immediately marked her as an outsider, as did her elegant posture and the way she clutched her bag with gloved hands. Miss Zimmerman? A portly man with a gray mustache approached, removing his hat. I'm Mayor Thornton. We've been expecting you. Pearl offered a polite smile. Thank you for meeting me, Mayor. I'm eager to settle in and begin preparations for the school term. Of course. Mrs. Garfield has prepared a room for you at her boarding house. It's the only such establishment in town, but she runs a respectable place. He gestured toward a 2-story building down the street. I'll have the boy take your trunk there. This is all I have, Pearl said, lifting her carpet bag slightly. The mayor's eyebrows rose, but he recovered quickly. Traveling light, I see. Well, the general store can provide anything you might need. Come along, I'll introduce you to Mrs. Garfield. As they walked, Pearl felt the stares of the townspeople. A new face was always a curiosity in small communities, but a single woman from the East was a particular novelty. She kept her chin up, ignoring the whispers that followed her progress down the street. Mrs. Garfield proved to be a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that Pearl immediately respected. She showed Pearl to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a washstand. Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon for those who can make it back, supper at 6 in the evening, Mrs. Garfield explained. I don't allow gentlemen callers in the rooms, and I expect all my boarders in by 9 o'clock. That sounds perfectly reasonable, Pearl assured her. I'll be spending most of my time at the schoolhouse once term begins. Mrs. Garfield's expression softened slightly. We've been without a proper teacher for nearly a year. The children have been running wild. I hope you know what you're in for, Miss Zimmerman. Pearl squared her shoulders. I assure you, Mrs. Garfield, I'm quite capable of managing a classroom. The older woman nodded approvingly. I believe you might be at that. Rest today. Tomorrow's Sunday church service at 10 if you're of a mind to attend. Good way to meet the families of your future pupils. After Mrs. Garfield left, Pearl sank onto the bed, the reality of her situation finally hitting her. She was thousands of miles from everything familiar, in a town where she knew no one, about to undertake the education of children who had likely had little formal schooling. The enormity of the challenge brought a lump to her throat, but she swallowed it down resolutely. You wanted adventure, she reminded herself aloud. And independence. Well, Pearl Zimmerman, you've certainly found both. The following morning, Pearl dressed in her most modest gown, a navy blue cotton with white piping, and walked to the small white church at the end of town. Inside, the simple wooden pews were filling with families, the women in their Sunday best and the men looking uncomfortable in suits rarely worn. Pearl took a seat near the back, aware of the curious glances sent her way. Just as the service was about to begin, the church door opened one last time and a tall man entered with a young boy at his side. The man wore clean but well-worn clothes, clearly his version of Sunday best, and his sun-bronzed face spoke of long days outdoors. The boy beside him looked healthier than he had 2 months earlier, but still retained the watchful wariness of one who had learned life's harsher lessons too young. Mason guided Tim to a pew near the middle of the church, nodding politely to neighbors as they passed. He had been bringing the boy to town regularly, introducing him to the community and establishing his presence as Tim's guardian. The legal paperwork was still making its way through the system, but in the practical terms of frontier life, Tim was now known as Mason Zachariah's ward. It was only after they were seated that Mason noticed the unfamiliar woman in the back row. Even from a distance, he could tell she wasn't from Cottonwood Creek. Everything about her, from her carefully arranged hair to her Eastern-cut dress, marked her as a newcomer. Something about her solitary figure stirred his curiosity in a way he hadn't felt in years. After the service, as the congregation spilled out into the churchyard, Mason found himself maneuvering through the crowd to where Mayor Thornton was introducing the woman to various townspeople. "Ah, Mason," Thornton called when he spotted him. "Come meet our new schoolteacher." "Miss Zimmerman, this is Mason Zachariah, one of our local ranchers, and this young man is Timothy, his ward." Pearl extended her hand, noting the man's hesitation before taking it. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip firm but gentle. "Mr. Zachariah, Timothy." "It's a pleasure to meet you both." "Miss Zimmerman," Mason acknowledged, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Cottonwood Creek." Tim eyed the new teacher with undisguised suspicion. His experience with schools was limited and unpleasant. Pearl crouched slightly to address the boy at eye level. "How old are you, Timothy?" 12, madam," he answered cautiously. "But I don't need schooling. I help Mr. Zachariah on the ranch." Pearl's smile remained steady. "Is that so, and what sort of work do you do?" "I feed the chickens and collect eggs." "I'm learning to groom the horses too," Tim replied, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "Those are valuable skills," Pearl agreed, "but reading and numbers can be just as useful on a ranch. How will you know if you're being paid fairly when you sell your eggs if you can't count the money?" Tim frowned, considering this. Mason watched the exchange with interest, impressed by the teacher's approach. "School starts next Monday," Pearl continued. "I hope to see you there, Timothy. Mr. Zachariah, it was nice meeting you." As she moved on to greet other families, Mason found his gaze following her. There was something compelling about Miss Pearl Zimmerman, a strength beneath her refined exterior that suggested she might be equal to the challenge of taming Cottonwood Creek's neglected young minds. "She talks fancy," Tim observed on their ride home. Mason chuckled. "She's from back east, I expect. Different world there." "Are you really going to make me go to school?" Tim asked, the dread evident in his voice. Mason was silent for a moment, thinking of his own limited education and how it had hampered him. "Yes," he finally said. "Miss Zimmerman is right. Reading and numbers are tools, same as a good saddle or a sharp knife. I won't have you growing up without proper tools, Tim." The boy sighed dramatically, but didn't argue further. In the 2 months he'd lived with Mason, he'd learned that the cowboy was fair but firm in his decisions. "Maybe she won't be as bad as Mr. Perkins was," Tim conceded, referring to the previous teacher who had ruled the schoolhouse with an iron hand and a willow switch. Let's give her a chance, Mason suggested. Might surprise us both. What surprised Mason most in the days that followed was how often his thoughts turned to Pearl Zimmerman. He found himself riding into town for supplies he didn't strictly need, timing his visits to coincide with the end of the school day. He told himself he was just checking on Tim's adjustment to the classroom, but he couldn't deny the way his heart quickened when he caught sight of the schoolteacher on the steps, bidding farewell to her pupils. For her part, Pearl was finding Cottonwood Creek both more challenging and more rewarding than she had anticipated. Her class of 24 students ranged in age from 6 to 16, with vastly different levels of previous education. Some, like the banker's children, had been tutored at home and could read fluently. Others, including several ranch hands' offspring, could barely recognize their letters. Timothy Miller fell somewhere in the middle. He was bright but resistant, clearly intelligent but unwilling to demonstrate it for fear of standing out. Pearl recognized the self-protective instincts of a child who had learned to make himself invisible during difficult times. 2 weeks into the term, she kept him after class. "Timothy, I'd like to speak with you." The boy approached her desk warily. "Yes, Miss Zimmerman." "I've noticed you know more than you let on during recitations," she said directly. "You pretend to struggle with words I've seen you read easily when you think no one is watching." Tim's face flushed. "Don't know what you mean, madam," Pearl sighed. "Timothy, there's no shame in being smart. In fact, it's something to be proud of." "The other boys don't like show-offs," Tim muttered, "and I don't need their trouble." Understanding dawned on Pearl. "I see. Well, what if we make a deal? You stop hiding your abilities in my classroom, and I'll give you more advanced work that you can do privately. That way, you won't be showing off to the others, but you also won't be wasting your time pretending not to know things." Tim considered this, his young face serious. "You won't tell the other kids. It will be between us," Pearl promised. "And Mr. Zachariah, if you're comfortable with that." At the mention of Mason, Tim's expression brightened slightly. "He's teaching me to ride proper, says I'm a natural." Pearl smiled. "He seems like a good guardian." "He is," Tim said with unexpected ferocity. "Best man I ever knew, saved my life, Miss Zimmerman. I was starving by his fence when he found me. Could have chased me off, but he took me home instead. Fed me, gave me clothes, even went to the judge about making it legal for me to stay." Pearl was touched by the boy's loyalty. "You're very fortunate to have found each other." Tim nodded solemnly. "Mr. Mason says sometimes God puts people in your path when you need them most." "Guess he put Mr. Mason in mine." "And did God put you in Mr. Mason's path as well?" Pearl asked gently. Tim shrugged. "Don't know about that. Mr. Mason gets lonely out at the ranch, talks to his horses more than people most days, but he never complains." The image of the tall, reserved rancher conversing with his animals brought a smile to Pearl's lips. "Well, I'm glad you have each other now. So do we have a deal about your schoolwork?" Tim nodded. "Yes, madam, I'll stop pretending." "Excellent, you may go now." "Mr. Zachariah is probably waiting." Sure enough, when Tim exited the schoolhouse, Mason was leaning against a hitching post across the street, his hat tipped low over his eyes. The boy ran to him, and Pearl watched through the window as Mason ruffled Tim's hair with easy affection before helping him mount the smaller of 2 horses. As if sensing her gaze, Mason looked up at the schoolhouse window. Their eyes met briefly before Pearl stepped back, feeling an unexpected flutter in her chest. She busied herself gathering papers, trying to dismiss the moment as meaningless. She had come to Cottonwood Creek to teach, not to fall prey to foolish romantic notions about a handsome cowboy with kind eyes. The autumn days grew shorter, and as October painted the surrounding hills with gold and crimson, Cottonwood Creek prepared for its annual harvest festival. For Pearl, who had never experienced such a community celebration, the preparations were fascinating. The entire town became involved, men constructing tables and booths on the town square, women planning dishes for the communal feast, children practicing songs and recitations for the entertainment. "Miss Zimmerman," Mayor Thornton approached her after church one Sunday. The festival committee was hoping you might organize the children's performances for the Harvest Festival. The school has traditionally been responsible for that portion of the entertainment. Pearl agreed readily, seeing an opportunity to showcase her pupils' progress. She assigned poems and short skits, rehearsing with the children during lunch breaks and after school. Timothy, to her surprise, revealed a gift for memorization and a clear speaking voice once she convinced him to participate. Mason, who had been drafted into the booth-building crew, often found himself working near the schoolhouse in the late afternoons, the sound of children's voices reciting in unison drifting through the open windows. Occasionally, he would catch a glimpse of Pearl moving among her students, patient and encouraging. Something about the scene, her obvious dedication, and the way she treated even the rowdiest boys with respect stirred feelings he had long thought dormant. On the Wednesday before the festival, a sudden downpour caught Pearl and several students at the schoolhouse after hours. They had been practicing a particularly complex recitation, and now thunder rattled the windows as rain lashed against the clapboard siding. "You children stay put," Pearl instructed, peering out at the deluge. "It's too heavy to walk home in this." No sooner had she spoken than the schoolhouse door burst open, admitting a gust of wind and rain along with Mason Zachariah, his coat glistening with moisture. "Miss Zimmerman," he nodded, removing his dripping hat. "Thought you and the children might need some help getting home. I've got the wagon outside with a tarp." Relief washed over Pearl's face. "Mr. Zachariah, your timing is impeccable, thank you." Together, they shepherded the children into the covered wagon, arranging them beneath the tarp as best they could. Mason helped Pearl up last, his strong hands at her waist sending an unexpected warmth through her despite the chilly rain. "You'll have to hold tight," he warned as he climbed onto the driver's bench and took up the reins. "Roads are getting muddy." The journey through town was slow, dropping off children at their homes one by one. Parents appeared with grateful expressions, ushering their sodden offspring inside. Tim had been at home with a slight fever, so he wasn't among the group. Finally, only Pearl remained, huddled beneath the tarp as Mason guided the horses toward Mrs. Garfield's boarding house. "How is Timothy feeling?" Pearl asked, raising her voice above the drumming rain. "Better," Mason replied. "Fever broke this morning. He's disappointed about missing rehearsal, though, says he has an important part." Pearl smiled, though Mason couldn't see it. "He does. He's narrating the opening of our harvest poem. He has quite a good memory and a wonderful speaking voice when he's not trying to hide his intelligence." Mason glanced back at her in surprise. "He's been hiding? At school?" "Less so now," Pearl assured him. "We've come to an understanding. He was afraid of standing out, I think." "Being noticed can be dangerous when you're vulnerable." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense. Took him weeks to stop flinching whenever I raised my hand, even just to reach for something." Pearl's heart ached at the implication. "You've done wonders with him, Mr. Zachariah. He speaks of you with such admiration." Mason cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the praise. "He's a good boy, just needed someone to see that." They arrived at the boarding house, but the rain was falling harder than ever. Mason jumped down and came around to help Pearl descend. "You're soaked through," Pearl observed, noting how his shirt clung to his broad shoulders. "You must come in and dry off before heading back to the ranch." Mason hesitated, aware of Mrs. Garfield's strict rules about male visitors. Pearl sensed his concern. "The parlor is for receiving guests," she assured him. "Mrs. Garfield won't object to you warming yourself by the fire for a few minutes." After securing the horses, Mason followed Pearl into the boarding house. The parlor was empty, the fire burning low in the grate. Pearl added a log and stirred the embers until flames licked upward. "I'll make some tea," she offered, but Mason shook his head. "Don't trouble yourself, Miss Zimmerman, I won't stay long." An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling fire and the persistent drum of rain on the roof. Pearl was acutely aware of how improper they must look, both damp from the rain, alone in the parlor as evening approached. Yet she felt no fear, only a curious sense of rightness in Mason's presence. "I should thank you," she said finally, "for all your help with the school. The children respect you, and that makes them more inclined to listen to me as well." Mason's smile transformed his weathered face, softening the lines around his eyes. "You don't need my help, Miss Zimmerman. You've won them over all on your own." "Pearl," she said impulsively. "When we're not in front of the children, you could call me Pearl." Mason's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Pearl," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name, "it suits you." The moment stretched, charged with possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Then the front door opened, admitting Mrs. Garfield with an armload of groceries. The spell was broken. "I should go," Mason said, reaching for his still damp hat. "Thank you for the fire." "Thank you for the ride," Pearl replied, suddenly formal again. "Please tell Timothy I hope he feels better for the festival." Mason nodded and departed, leaving Pearl to face Mrs. Garfield's curious gaze and knowing smile. The day of the harvest festival dawned clear and crisp, the recent rains having washed the world clean. Pearl arrived at the town square early to help with final preparations, her students scheduled to perform after the midday feast. Timothy, fully recovered, had been picked up earlier by Mason for a quick trip to the ranch for forgotten items. The town square had been transformed overnight. Colorful bunting stretched between lampposts. Booths lined the perimeter offering games and crafts for sale, and long tables covered with checkered cloths awaited the food that women were already beginning to bring in covered dishes and baskets. By noon, the celebration was in full swing. Families gathered around the tables laden with roasted meats, corn bread, pies, and every variety of preserve and pickle imaginable. Children darted between adults, their excitement palpable. A small band had set up near the gazebo, providing lively tunes that had several couples dancing on a wooden platform constructed for the purpose. Pearl spotted Mason and Tim arriving, the boy chattering animatedly while Mason nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. They had both made an effort with their appearance, Tim in a new shirt and Mason in a clean jacket that emphasized his broad shoulders. Pearl found herself smoothing her own dress, a deep green wool that she had saved for special occasions. "Miss Zimmerman," Tim called when he spotted her. "Mr. Mason says my new shirt makes me look distinguished," Pearl laughed. "Indeed it does, Timothy. Are you ready for your performance?" The boy nodded eagerly. "I practiced all morning, even made Mr. Mason listen 5 times." Mason approached more slowly, his eyes taking in Pearl's appearance with evident appreciation. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her, tipping his hat, "you look very nice today." "Thank you, Mr. Zachariah," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "As do you." Tim looked between them with undisguised interest before Pearl shooed him off to join the other children preparing for their performance. "He seems fully recovered," Pearl observed. "Right as rain," Mason agreed. "Stubborn as a mule, too. Insisted on riding his own horse today rather than sharing mine. He's growing up," Pearl said softly. "You've given him that chance, Mason." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the effect was immediate. Mason's eyes, usually guarded, softened as they met hers. "It's been good for both of us," he admitted. "House was too quiet before. Now there's someone to talk to besides the horses." Pearl smiled, remembering Tim's similar comment. "Still, it must be challenging at times raising a boy on your own." Mason shrugged. "No harder than teaching 24 of them, I expect." "Yes, but I send them home at the end of the day," Pearl pointed out. "True enough." Mason hesitated, then added, "Though sometimes I think Tim could use a woman's influence. There are things I don't know how to teach him." The implications of his words hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Pearl felt her heart quicken, but before she could respond, Mayor Thornton's voice boomed across the square, announcing that the children's performances would begin. "I should go," Pearl said reluctantly. "The children need me to organize them," Mason nodded. "I'll be watching." The performances went better than Pearl had dared hope. The youngest children sang a harvest song that had the audience smiling indulgently. The middle group recited a poem about the changing seasons with only a few forgotten lines. And the oldest students, including Timothy, presented a short play about the first Thanksgiving that earned genuine applause. Throughout it all, Pearl was aware of Mason's tall figure at the edge of the crowd, his attention unwavering. When the performances concluded and the children scattered to enjoy the festival's other offerings, he made his way to her side. "They did well," he said, "especially Tim. Never seen him so confident." Pride swelled in Pearl's chest. "He's a remarkable boy. You should be very proud." "I am," Mason said simply. Then, with uncharacteristic hesitation, he added, "Would you care to walk with me, Miss Zimmerman? Pearl, there's something I'd like to discuss with you." Curious, Pearl agreed, and they strolled away from the busiest part of the festival toward the church garden, where late autumn roses still bloomed against the south-facing wall. Mason seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his usual easy silence now charged with tension. "I've been thinking," he finally began, "about Tim's future, and my own." Pearl waited, sensing he needed to find his own way to what he wanted to say. "The ranch is doing well," he continued. "Better than I expected this year. I've put aside money for Tim's education, should he want more schooling after your teaching. But a boy needs more than just provision. He needs a proper family." Pearl's breath caught as Mason turned to face her directly, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "What I'm trying to say, not very well, is that I find myself thinking of you often, Pearl. Too often for a man who only means to be friendly. I watch you with the children with Tim, and I see a kindness and strength that I admire greatly. I know we haven't known each other long, and you might have plans that don't include staying in Cottonwood Creek, but Mason," Pearl interrupted gently, her heart pounding. "Are you courting me?" A flush crept up his tanned neck. "Trying to, not doing a very good job of it, I expect." Pearl surprised them both with a laugh, the joy she'd been holding back bubbling over. "On the contrary, you're doing just fine." Hope brightened his eyes. "Then you wouldn't be opposed to the idea of my courtship?" "I would welcome it," Pearl said honestly. "I've found myself thinking of you two, perhaps too often for a schoolteacher who means to be respectable." Mason's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. Emboldened, he reached for her hand, his rough palm enveloping her smaller one with gentle pressure. "I should warn you," Pearl added, suddenly serious. "I came west to build a new life for myself. I won't give up teaching even if things progress between us." "I wouldn't ask you to," Mason assured her. "This town needs you, those children need you, Tim needs you." He paused, then added softly, "I need you." The simple declaration, spoken without artifice or calculation, moved Pearl deeply. In Boston, her suitors had been polished and educated, offering flowery compliments and practiced charm. None had affected her as profoundly as this cowboy's straightforward words. "Then we understand each other," she said, squeezing his hand. "We do," Mason agreed, "though there's one more thing I should mention. If I'm to court you properly, Mrs. Garfield's parlor won't do for all our conversations. I'd like to invite you and Tim to the ranch for Sunday dinner tomorrow, so you can see where we live, how we live." "I'd like that very much," Pearl said, imagining the modest ranch house Tim had described, picturing Mason in his own environment. A shout from the festival interrupted them, Tim calling Mason's name, searching for them among the crowd. "We should get back," Pearl said reluctantly. Mason nodded but didn't release her hand immediately. "Pearl," he said, his voice low and serious, "I want you to know that whatever happens between us, you've already changed our lives, mine and Tim's, for the better, by seeing him as he really is, by seeing me." The simple truth of his words touched Pearl deeply. "And you've changed mine, Mason Zachariah, by reminding me why I came west in the first place, not just to teach but to find something real." As they walked back toward the festival, their hands reluctantly parting as they came into view of the townspeople, Pearl felt a certainty she had never experienced in Boston. The path ahead might not be easy. Nothing worthwhile in the West ever was, but for the first time, she could envision a future that combined her vocation with the love she had secretly longed for. That evening, as the harvest moon rose over Cottonwood Creek, casting silver light across the weathered buildings and dusty streets, three souls who had once been adrift found themselves anchored by newfound connections. Timothy, who had sat hungry by a fence just months ago, now had a home, a guardian who cared for him, and a teacher who believed in his potential. Mason, who had worked his land in solitude for years, speaking more to horses than to people, now found himself planning for a future that included not just the boy he had saved, but perhaps the woman who had captured his heart. And Pearl, who had fled east to find purpose in the West, discovered that purpose could encompass not only her vocation, but also the love that was blossoming between her and the quiet cowboy who had opened his heart and home to an orphan child. As the festivities wound down and families headed home beneath the star-studded Texas sky, Mason helped Pearl into Mrs. Garfield's buggy, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Until tomorrow," he said, his voice a promise. "Until tomorrow," Pearl echoed, her smile carrying all the hope of new beginnings. And as the buggy pulled away, Tim watched from atop his pony, a knowing grin spreading across his young face. The future that had once seemed so bleak now stretched before him, filled with possibilities: a home, a family forming around him, and the certainty that sometimes the darkest moments could lead to the brightest dawns. The hungry boy by the fence was gone forever, replaced by a child who was beginning to believe that happy endings weren't just found in schoolbooks, but could happen in real life too, even, or perhaps especially, in the wild and beautiful Texas frontier.